Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. How are you? I would like to welcome you to another exciting event in our Krasno event series. And I'm very pleased to see that the room is full again. I would say it's overfull, which is just what we need. So thank you for coming. That's great. And thank you for my students for coming too, which is not always clear that they come. But today, because of that exciting topic today, they've certainly shown up. I'm Klaus Laris. I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And it's sunny again in Chapel Hill, which is good to know. Before we start officially and properly, I would like to point out our mailing list to you again. Please, if you haven't signed up, sign up on our mailing list. There's also our website, krasnoevents.com. All the necessary information about our forthcoming events is there. You can find it there. And we also have a YouTube channel, youtube.com, KrasnoUNC, and we videotape all our events, as you know, and you can watch them there as often as you would like to do. And I would also like to mention there is an event covering Brexit at the European Studies Center sometime in April. And we have another exciting event, a special event on the 2nd of April, which hasn't yet been advertised, but will be advertised soon. And that is an event about cybersecurity and cyber warfare. So highly exciting as well. And I will, send out more information on that in the next couple of weeks or so. As you know, the UK is about to leave the European Union on the 29th of March of this year, 2019, at exactly 11 p.m. at night for some reason. At the moment, as you will also know, there's a bit of chaos and turmoil in London, certainly a lot of uncertainty. Will it be Theresa May's deal, which will eventually be signed? Will there be an exit without any deal at all? Will there be perhaps a delay of the departure of the UK from the European Union? Or might there even be a second referendum? We really don't know. And the New York Times indicated perhaps Brexit will lead to Irish unification. So all that is still up in the air. We don't know. And then there is a big question of the Irish backstop. What actually precisely is the Irish backstop? But aren't we lucky that we have an expert here today who will explain it all to us and will make sense of the whole situation? And that is our distinguished speaker today, that is Norman Houston from the Northern Ireland office in Washington, D.C. Norman runs the office, is director of the Northern Ireland office in D.C. and he's also a very long-standing civil servant from Belfast in Northern Ireland. Norman and I did not meet in Belfast, though I lived, as you know, I lived in Belfast for many years, but I heard about Norman in Belfast and everyone told very good things about Norman. And we met in, I think, 2010 in Washington, D.C. and I was immediately impressed that Norman knows almost everyone in DC. There's hardly anyone he doesn't know. And so that was very useful for me because he could connect me to lots of people in DC. Norman has been heading the Northern Ireland office in DC since 2007. He has enhanced the profile of Northern Ireland in Washington, but also in the country at large and in Canada since 2007. He has facilitated the visits of the First Minister and the Deputy Minister in Northern Ireland to the Oval Office. He visited George W. Bush, he visited Obama, and I understand he has also become a very good friend of Donald Trump's. This is not quite correct. Maybe he will let us know the details later. And for all his great services, he recently obtained was awarded an OBE from the Queen last year in 2018. So it's a great pleasure to have Norman Houston here tonight. And Norman will talk about Northern Ireland and Brexit, the troubles, the border, and the future. Please join me in welcoming Norman Houston to the Krasno event series. Good luck.
Professor Lars, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Could I just check, can everybody hear me at the back of the room? Okay. I'm very pleased to be here. As the professor says, I am the diplomat representing Northern Ireland in the United States. I'm also the longest serving diplomat at the British Embassy, having served just over 11 years in post. And I'm also something of a conundrum in the embassy in that while I'm there the longest, I'm also the only person that doesn't actually represent anything. And I say that slightly mischievously because our government in Northern Ireland collapsed just over 2 years ago. And I'm going to come to that later in my discussion. And what I hope to do is talk for maybe about 25, 30 minutes and then do some questions, both with the professor and then with all you people who have kindly turned up this afternoon. I want to talk a little bit early on about the Good Friday Agreement, the seismic change it made to the island of Ireland and more widely to the United Kingdom. And to put the Good Friday Agreement into the context of where we are now in the absence of a functioning executive and the dilemma and the chaos, for want of a better word, around the United Kingdom's imminent departure from the European Union. Anyone with even a cursory knowledge of Irish politics or Irish history would know something of the Troubles, the euphemism that we used for the period of internecine violence. I was 10 years old when the Troubles began, and I was 40 years old when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. So to save the maths, I'm now 60 years old. So I've had for the past 20, almost indeed 21 years of my life, I have either lived in or represented a Northern Ireland that many of us thought would never exist, a generally peaceful and prosperous Northern Ireland, which is based on the premise of equality and equal representation. The Troubles, for most of you, were very bad stories on CNN and the news. For people in Northern Ireland, they were a daily way of life. During that period, 3,600 people died. These people lost their lives that probably would have been alive today. If you extrapolated that out into the United States population of around 300 million people, you would have lost 650,000 of your fellow countrymen and women. So I think that gives some emphasis to how terrible this internecine conflict was, and indeed how intractable it seemed to be. It was, for over 3 decades, the British government's largest and most serious domestic policy issue. As I said, it never seemed to be resolved, and successive governments failed miserably in trying to bring peace to this very small corner of the United Kingdom and Europe. But a seemingly intractable problem, in my view, was helped because in a sort of political stratosphere, 3 very important people, in my humble opinion, came together around the same time. Bill Clinton was elected President of the United States. Bertie Ahern took over as Taoiseach, which is the Irish word for Prime Minister in Dublin, and Tony Blair came into Downing Street. And these 3 men built up a friendship around many things, but most importantly, the Irish question, the Northern Irish question. And Tony Blair in particular had grown up as a young boy spending his holidays in Donegal in the Republic of Ireland, because that's where his mother's people were from. And he remembers those very rare trips into into Northern Ireland through border checkpoints. And I think from a very early age, he will still say that he felt this is something that could be resolved. So with these 3 very powerful men in positions of authority, George Mitchell was appointed to head talks with all the parties in Northern Ireland with the view of creating a political pathway to peace and reconciliation. And I don't want to give a whole history lesson about what Senator Mitchell did, but he still is an enormous hero in Northern Ireland, not only for his patience, but for his intellect and for the fact that he has still stayed with the Northern Ireland question. And the Good Friday Agreement, which was signed in April 1998, was a seismic change in politics in Northern Ireland and in the island of Ireland, and for a number of reasons. And very briefly, the Good Friday Agreement had 3 very important strands to it. Strand 1 involved only Northern Ireland, how we were going to govern ourselves, what was going to make everyone in Northern Ireland feel equally valued. And that brought in a number of issues. Number one, we were going to have a power-sharing executive. There would be a mandatory coalition. In other words, no one party in Northern Ireland would ever run the place again for their own political will. It had to be a power-sharing executive. We were going to have 108 people in our legislative body, the Northern Ireland Assembly. Why 108? There's only 1.8 million people. Is it over-governance? But the reason we went for the figure of 108 was that there were fringe parties in Northern Ireland, particularly on the loyalist side, which generally speaking would not have got a lot of votes. But the idea was, when George Mitchell was designing the new agreement, it was very important to have everybody in the tent rather than some people outside. And the mathematics of the thing was, if you had 108 members, there was every likelihood that because of proportional representation, those people on the periphery would also be included. It also meant the reform of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the police force which had been formed in 1921 after the partition of Ireland to police Northern Ireland. That police force had lost a lot of officers due to the violence of the 30 years that had taken place before. But it had been a largely Protestant unionist force, up to perhaps 92%. And there was a feeling that if we were going to have a new start, we needed a police force that could be recognised by both communities. And we had a major review of policing under Lord Chris Patten, who had been formerly the Governor-General of Hong Kong. And we had a new policing force formed called the Police Service of Northern Ireland, which still exists today. And to make that as palatable as possible to everyone in the community, older police officers were offered a package really to go early, and the police service began a 50-50 recruitment process to try to build up, or take away, I should say, the imbalance between the very large number of unionists in the police and the very small number of nationalists. We also had the release of prisoners. Many people had been convicted of very serious crimes in Northern Ireland, and they were serving prison sentences. And one of the deals for the agreement was that these political prisoners, for want of a better word, would be released on licence. In other words, if they got out and behaved like normal citizens, they could stay out. However, if they transgressed again and did something that was criminally wrong, they could be put back into to prison again. And in the Republic of Ireland, the people of the island of Ireland went to the polls. There were 2 referenda on the island. And in the Republic of Ireland, 94% of the people in the Republic of Ireland voted in favour of the Good Friday Agreement. Now, you may say, why did they have to vote on it if it was a Northern Ireland thing? But it was actually an all-island agreement. And for the people of the Republic of Ireland, it meant changing Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution of the Republic of Ireland, which at that stage claimed sovereignty over the whole island. And those articles were changed to reflect the fact that at a time when the people in Northern Ireland wanted to vote to be part of a united Ireland, it would be axiomatic that that would happen, rather than having this unilateral claim by Dublin. And it also meant that people in Northern Ireland, for the first time in over 70 years, could decide for themselves whether they wanted to be recognised as Irish or British or both. So both traditions were, for first and foremost, were recognised as having equal validity in Northern Ireland. Then we had Strand 2, and then again for the first time in 70 years, we were going to have north-south bodies. This had never happened before. The border was there. It was a very strict border because of terrorism. There wasn't a lot of reciprocity between the 2 parts of the island. But what Strand 2 did, and it really was very important for people from the nationalist community, it created a north-south ministerial council. So for the first time since the partition of the island of Ireland, ministers from Belfast and ministers from Dublin would meet on a vast range of issues which were important to the island. I couldn't go through all 12 of them now, but probably the most important one, and one that I was involved in before I took this job over, was Tourism Ireland. So for the first time again, one body was going to market the island of Ireland as a tourist destination around the world. And that made a very big difference. The third element of the agreement was that there would be east-west relations. So the island of Ireland, Dublin and Belfast, would meet regularly as in ministers with Edinburgh in Scotland, Cardiff in Wales, the Sovereign Parliament in Westminster, and the smaller parliaments in the Isle of Man, that little island in the Irish Sea between Ireland and United Kingdom, Great Britain, and the Channel Islands off the coast of France. So you would have this sort of pan-Irish, pan-British island body, which would create the axis, not just north-south, but also east-west. So what did this do? First of all, it got rid of the violence, which was an enormous problem in Northern Ireland. I mean, I grew up in Northern Ireland, as you probably guessed from the accent, and I would have travelled to university, and I would have, been late back at night because there had been a bomb scare, or there had been a building blowing up, or there had been a demonstration. And all that went very quickly after the Good Friday Agreement. Equally importantly, the British Army began to dismantle the posts they had around the border. For those of you who would have visited Ireland in those days, when you reached Northern Ireland from the south, you would have encountered military posts, watchtowers, soldiers in uniforms, etc., etc. And that whole architecture of tension, the physical side of it, disappeared. But it also led the way for the economic growth in Northern Ireland, which had been completely stagnated by the lack of investment, mostly due to the fact that if you were an American company or a Japanese company, you were not likely to go to somewhere where there was civil unrest. And that changed very quickly as well. The economy in the past 20 years has completely skyrocketed. We now have fewer than 4% or less than 4% of our population unemployed. We're one of the most attractive areas in the United Kingdom for inward investment, particularly for cybersecurity, for medical technology, for back offices. Just as a very small example, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange in obviously Chicago, Illinois, all their back office work is done in Belfast. CVS, the drug company that owns all the stores around the United States, all their work in ordering and delivery and supply is actually done electronically now in Belfast. So a lot of new jobs have come in. We have 900 overseas companies, 180 of them are from the United States. 180 companies employ 35,000 people. The United States is exceptionally important to us, not only in terms of helping the peace process, but also helping with our economy. Last year, 250,000 Americans visited Northern Ireland, a lot for the Gulf, a lot to see the Game of Thrones site because it's filmed in Northern Ireland, all that sort of stuff. And by the way, Northern Ireland people turned film into a two-syllable word, so just be aware, we say film. So we do a lot of that sort of thing, and the economy has really taken off. But underlying those issues of growth and economic well-being and tourism and, all the new hotels that opened in Belfast and all that sort of thing, there are some underlying problems we never really managed to address properly. And the most obvious is community tension. So while I can stand up here and talk about the wonderful statistics about inward investment and tourism, which is all true, and anybody going to Belfast now who hasn't been for at least 10 years will be completely, they will not believe how much the city has changed with new hotels and new buildings. But we have never really managed to deal with the issue of community division. And we still have a school system which is divided. And only about 9% of children in Northern Ireland go to schools which are integrated. In other words, it doesn't matter whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant, you go to the one school. The rest of them, the other 91%, go to our segregated system of education. And in some cases, those young people will not meet someone of the other tradition until they are fortunate enough to go to university. And of course, not everyone does go to university. And the issue is more pronounced in the less well-off areas. If you get into the middle-class leafy suburbia, it's less of a problem because people do live side by side. But in those areas that are very, we say, working class, they are very much divided. And the peace dividend, which I have talked about just a few seconds ago, has not really reached those communities. And that is one of the issues that we have been really struggling to deal with. And of course, our whole system collapsed, as I said, 2 years ago, when we had a situation where the Deputy First Minister, the late Martin McGuinness, resigned. And that meant that the thing collapsed because there's a balancing act in our system. So if one minister goes, the other one doesn't have power, and the whole thing collapsed. And there are a number of theories about why that happened. One is to do with the heating scandal, which is extremely complicated to explain, but the government had set up a scheme which allowed people to transfer from oil central heating to burning wood pellets, and they were going to get a grant to do this. And it transpired that the level of grant that the end user was getting turned out to be exceptionally profitable, and it was draining the executive budget, and that ended up being something of an issue, and the whole system collapsed. Now, quite a few attempts have been made to re-establish the executive, and until now, there's been no real progress on that. There is a school of thought that we will probably not have an executive up and running again and an assembly until Brexit is sorted. And the professor did mention Brexit, and I do have to say a couple of things about this. Is that Scotland and Wales have first ministers. So they have someone going to number 10 and lobbying the British government, Mrs May, on behalf of their region about what they want to be protected if, or when, I should say, the United Kingdom leaves Europe. In Northern Ireland, we don't have ministers, and therefore that issue has become quite difficult. And it's complicated for a number of other reasons. And the most obvious one is that if you take a border away on a small island like Ireland and the economy grows, it's axiomatic that the two economies will merge very quickly and become one economy. And I'm not making a constitutional political point here, I'm making an economic point. And if you look now at Northern Ireland, every year 110 million people cross the border in 1 year. I mean, that's obviously people going back and forward to work and everything, but there's 110 million people, border crossings by people every year. 6.4 million trucks cross that border every year with goods, mostly for export, going back and forward. So if you look at the agri-foods industry, which is still massive in Ireland, look at, for instance, Kerrygold butter, which some of you may buy in the supermarket here. 80% of the milk to make that butter comes from dairy farmers in Northern Ireland, which goes down south to be made into butter and cheese and yogurts and all sorts of things. If you are a young child in Ireland, on the island of Ireland, and you are a cancer victim, you will be treated in the Crumlin Hospital in Dublin. Doesn't matter where you're from in the island, that's where you go. If you're an adult suffering from cancer in the west of Ireland, Donegal, Sligo, Leitrim, Mayo, you will be treated in Londonderry at Altnagelden Hospital in Northern Ireland. We have a single electricity grid, and everybody likes a glass of Guinness. Guinness is brewed in Dublin, but it's bottled and canned in Belfast, and then it's shipped back. It's taken back down by truck to be exported from the Republic. So once you have all those links all over the island, and then Brexit comes along, you begin to think, how on earth are we ever going to make this resolvable? And this has been the big issue, because when the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, up until that time, there was almost no debate on the Irish border issue. And it's become an unfortunate consequence of United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union. And while I don't personally speak on behalf of the British government, it is the British government's biggest issue now in terms of dealing with Europe about what happens about the Irish border. And nobody wants a hard border. But the issue is that it's all very well saying that, but what do you have in its place? I mean, people have talked about having some sort of electronic type of system that you would have if you're on the freeway here, where you pay for your ride up the motorway by some sort of computer on the front of your windscreen. But nobody seems to think that that really would work. The border is 300 miles long, and currently there are 210 crossings on that border, which I believe is actually more than you have on the Canadian border and all that thousands of miles. And you've got to remember that border was created in 1921. So, there were farms before 1921, there were villages before 1921. So, it's not some sort of ravine, or it's not the Rio Grande River or anything like that. You don't often know when you're in one part of Ireland or the other. And there are other very basic issues. If you get on a bus in Dundalk, in Louth, on the eastern seaboard, and you want to go to Donegal, you will crisscross out of Northern Ireland about 3 times because the border's a zigzag. So there's all sorts of issues which people are grappling with. And of course, the other issue is that almost 56% of the people in Northern Ireland voted to stay in the European Union. And if you look at a map of Northern Ireland, the people who voted to stay in were all in the border areas. The people who voted to leave were in the northeast corner, County Antrim, North Down, who actually aren't, they're the ones that are furthest away from the border. And there's been a number of attempts to try and resolve this conundrum. How do you leave the European Union and still keep a fluidity of a border in Northern Ireland? And that's why we're in the situation we are today. There is to be a debate and a vote in the Westminster Parliament next Tuesday, a week from today, to discuss this very issue and to try and get a vote. There were a number of issues brought up, and one of them, of course, is the backstop. And the issue was that the United Kingdom has to agree a protocol with the European Union after they leave, an agreement really to leave. And the idea of the backstop was that if there wasn't an agreement, and for instance, the British government, Britain crashed out of the European Union, the backstop, I suppose, is the best way of describing it, was an insurance policy. And that insurance policy, it secured the fact that Northern Ireland would remain in the customs union. So in other words, the border wouldn't exist for any normal reason. But the problem with that was that where do you have the border then? Because do you shove it into the Irish Sea, and then you have an issue where if you're in Northern Ireland and you're exporting to the rest of the United Kingdom, do you start having to produce customs certificates at the port of Larne or the Belfast port or the international airport in Belfast or whatever? And for a sizable number of people within the Unionist community, and the DUP in particular, the Democratic Unionist Party, that was a bridge too far. And if you look at the minute at Theresa May's government in London, she does not have an overall majority. And she is relying on 10 votes by the Democratic Unionist Party, which is the biggest Unionist party in Northern Ireland. And also, somewhat peculiarly, it is the only real party from Northern Ireland in Westminster at the minute, because Northern Ireland has 18 seats in Westminster. The DUP have 10, as I said a few seconds ago, and then there's one independent unionist, Lady Sylvia Herman, who represents North Down. So that's 11 people. Where are the other 7? Well, the other 7 are all Sinn Féin. So Sinn Féin, which is the major party of the nationalist community, they have the other 7 seats. And for all sorts of theological reasons, they have never wanted to take their seats in the British Parliament, because they see themselves, as you can imagine, very much Irish, and they therefore don't want to, as they would see it, maybe go against their voters by taking up those seats. So we have a situation now where the balance of power in Westminster is so fine, and the DUP has such a lot of strength within the Tory government. and just over about 12 months ago, they signed a Confidence in Supply Act with the British government, which basically said, in those crucial issues, we will vote with you to maintain the government, keep the government in majority. Now, they haven't always done that. Sometimes if it's a welfare issue and things like that, they've voted, with the opposition. But when it comes to crucial issues to do with Brexit and the sovereignty of the UK, they will vote with the incumbent government. And that in itself has caused a lot of issues in Northern Ireland, because what the Good Friday Agreement did when we had a government up and running, it gave a feeling that everybody had an equal right to be there, and that decisions taken by our executive had gone through what I would call some sort of sift to make sure that they were equally a quality assessment or whatever. What has happened now is that the debate in Northern Ireland over Brexit has become very fractious. It's very fractious in the UK, but it's particularly bad in Northern Ireland, because a lot of people, I think mostly from the nationalist community, are concerned that if there were to be a border, or there be some sort of customs realignment, that the benefits that had been gained by the Good Friday Agreement would be lost. Now, the British Prime Minister has made it exceptionally clear that she is completely and utterly committed to the Good Friday Agreement, but it has become a major issue for many people in Northern Ireland. And what also is interesting, if you follow European politics, is that all 27 of the remaining countries, obviously Ireland plus the other 26, have been completely rock solid in pushing for some sort of guarantee on a backstop. And they have not broken ranks at any stage on the negotiations with the United Kingdom to leave. So the whole issue of the Brexit has taken up every intellectual bandwidth within government in the United Kingdom. It's the only subject in town. Nobody really seems to know what the way forward is. The professor had mentioned whether there'd be another referendum or not. I mean, that sort of discussion has begun to take place within Westminster. And as I say, I don't speak for the number 10 in the British government. I think it remains to be seen what happens on Tuesday of next week. If Mrs May gets her deal through Parliament, it looks more straightforward in how Britain would leave the European Union. And I mean, we're only talking about 3 or 4 weeks from now. If that doesn't work, and cleverer people than I haven't been able to really work out where we go, perhaps it will lead to an extension of the period, and we don't leave on the 29th. We ask for an extension of Article 50 to stay in. I just really don't know what the answer to that is. I do have to say that in my entire career in government, the two biggest issues for me has been, first of all, the Good Friday Agreement, which was a very positive thing and basically changed my career path, and Brexit, which I think has the potential to make things very difficult for a lot of people in Northern Ireland. But having said that, I do not think that Northern Ireland will return to the violence of the past. I think 20 years of peace has made a big difference, and I don't think, and we have we now have a second generation of children being born who don't know what the troubles were. I mean, my own children were born, were only 4 and 7 when we signed the Good Friday Agreement. They have no knowledge of the troubles, and people around 30 now in Northern Ireland are having children and they don't really remember the troubles. So I think we've moved beyond that. But what it has done, it has created a terrible uncertainty, and it has certainly not done anything to heal relationships in our small part of the island of Ireland. I don't really propose to say any more now because we've chatted quite a bit, and I think it might be more useful if you ask me questions.
Thank you very much. President Trump, who is a close friend of yours, I'm just joking. President Trump has actually expressed himself in favor of Brexit several times during the election campaign, but also more recently. So when he does so, does he ignore the Northern Irish question, or why would he express himself in favor?
I can't really speak, I suppose, for President Trump. I do think that there is a difference between the general view that he did express about supporting the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, which was different, obviously, from what President Obama had tried to do before he went out of office. But I do think there is certainly within the State Department side of the Trump administration and with the people in Belfast and the consulate, there's a very clear understanding of the problems that a hard border would cause. And, there have been discussions with the White House about, do we need a special envoy to deal with the Northern Ireland situation? And that has never, there was discussion we were going to get one and we weren't going to get one, but there is a debate about that. I don't think in terms of what he said, and I obviously can't speak for the President, that there was any real focus on the issue. And I think the real problem is that during the whole discussion about the United Kingdom leaving, I mean, if you followed the debate in the United Kingdom, there were buses going through London with big posters saying, if we leave the European Union, we can put £20 million a week into the National Health Service or whatever. And none of those things have actually now transpired in terms of that. The other issue is, and I think I did refer to it earlier, when all this discussion was going on about why we should leave, Northern Ireland and the border never came up. And it's one of those sort of things that sort of came up at the end of the whole thing, and people realised they had a real problem. And maybe I shouldn't really speak out of school on this, but I think if I were somebody voting in England to leave, I don't think I would personally be thinking about, oh dear, if I vote to leave, it's going to cause problems in Northern Ireland. And one of the worrying things about this is that Bristol University in September last year did a survey in Northern Ireland, and they specifically spoke to only those people in Northern Ireland who had voted to leave. So it did. The majority of people obviously wanted to stay, 56%, but they went to the other 44%. And one of the questions they asked was, if Brexit leads to a return to violence, would you still vote to leave? Okay. And 77% of those people said yes, that they would still, even if Northern Ireland descended into violence again, they would still vote to leave. And I think it shows that there is quite a strong number of people who just don't want to be part of the European Union. You can try and explain it whatever way you want, but it's quite a big figure.
Thank you very much. That is very surprising. Yes, indeed. We have talked about the Conservative Party, the Tory Party, about the DUP, for example, but we haven't mentioned the Labour Party in Britain at all. And Labour is, of course, the opposition party, the biggest opposition party. If the majority of Labour MPs would vote with Mrs. May for her exit deal, then I think it would be no problem. She would have a majority and Britain could leave the EU under the terms she has negotiated. Why is that not going to happen, or why at the moment does it look unlikely that Labour is going to side with her?
Well, I suspect Labour's hoping that they will be the next government. I think that like all these, look at the way UK politics is arranged. I mean, I suspect that Labour are hedging their bets to find out, will it lead to a general election, and is there a possibility of a Labour administration? I mean, I simply don't know. There's a lot of issues. Both parties, if you look at any of the analysis of them, are very split. I mean, even look at the Tory party, from the absolutely adamant Brexiteers who are pushing Mrs. May to the last word on, getting out of the European Union, to other members of her cabinet who don't want to leave with a no deal. So you have issues there about how much control does she actually have of her own party. And you need to be the most basic political scientists could read that in the paper. But if you look also at Labour's very split at the minute. Between, there's been a lot of discussion about allegations of anti-Semitism if you read any of the good quality British papers, there's a lot of discussion that within the Labour Party there are schisms as well. So, I don't think either party is particularly strong. And I don't think either party is, 100% for Brexit and the other party is 100% against it. I think there's I've never seen British politics in my career so divided.
Do you think it will lead to a splitting up of the parties in Britain?
Well, I don't know. I mean, if you just recently, 11 members of Parliament, some from the Labour Party and some from the Tory Party, have left their respective parties. They haven't formed another party, but there's 11 of them, and there's been discussion there might be more, but that hasn't happened since the Lib Dems were formed,
In the early 1980s,
yeah.
Thank you. There's a lot of anxiety about the economy, both the UK-wide economy and, of course, the Northern Irish economy. The Brexiteers say it's all exaggerated, the economy will not suffer at all, while the Remainers say, a projected doom and gloom scenario regarding the economy. What is the reality? How will Brexit affect the economy as far as you can judge?
Well, I can really only speak from the Northern Ireland perspective. I mean, we have done very well, as I said, from the Good Friday Agreement and the open border, and we've got, just last week another American company announced they were going to create 250 high-tech jobs in Belfast. So we have been doing actually quite well out of the Northern Ireland spin. I mean, one of the strange things about Northern Ireland, and I have to say this, I'm from Northern Ireland, is that while we have this terrible split in our education system where people don't really mix, where we actually score really high is on high school education and university graduates. One of the things we seem to have got right is the quality of our education, which is bringing a lot of people in. And we haven't actually found yet people are stalling to find out what the result of Brexit is going to be. But what I do know is any sort of hard border would be very detrimental for the Northern Ireland economy, for the reason I mentioned earlier, that the economic synergies between the two parts of the island, or partnerships, whatever you want to call them, have really, really strengthened over the past 2 decades. And there are a myriad of examples of Northern Ireland companies with subsidiaries in the south and vice versa and all that sort of stuff. So it would be very difficult for us. It also would be difficult for us in the area of migrant labour. Northern Ireland was never a place where people came to live unless you were from Northern Ireland, obviously because of the Troubles. But one of the things happened with the growth of the economy was we didn't have enough people to work in the businesses. And we have a very large number of European migrant workers now. So many now that there's a weekly flight to Gdansk in Poland. For the Polish people, we have masses in the churches on a Sunday in Polish. We have a Polish supermarket, all that sort of stuff. We have a very large number of people from the Baltic states, all working mostly in our agri-foods industry. 10% of the people working in our health service, particularly nurses and doctors, are from other European countries. There's the really sort of strange thing about this is that in the absence of a functioning executive, as in ministers, a lot of the discussion about the economy has fallen to the business community. And the business community in Northern Ireland has become more and more vocal about things like the backstop, and they will produce all sorts of reports to show that the economy will be affected by any sort of Brexit that doesn't deal with the customs union issue.
Thank you. There even now is a Chinese consulate in Belfast, I understand.
Yes, well, we have a Chinese consulate. We have an honorary Polish consul general. The most important one remains the US Consulate General, which is very popular, I have to tell you, in Northern Ireland. But we because we're so small, we wouldn't normally have consulates general. Usually somebody working in, say, the American or the Chinese embassy in London would come back and forward reasonably regularly. But we have now a Chinese one, and we have about 50 honorary consul generals. So these are people who are not full-time diplomats like I am, but they have an honorary position representing Portugal or Spain or all the places we trade with.
Thank you. As we discussed before, since the Brexit vote in 2016, around about 100,000 people have died who voted to leave the European Union. So when we take that into account and also take into account the better base of information we have now than we had in 2016, do you think if there was another Brexit vote, a second referendum was being held UK-wide, would the number be different? And to remind you, there were 50% UK-wide who voted to leave the EU, and I believe 56% in Northern Ireland wanted to stay in the EU. So would these numbers be roughly the same, or would you expect, and I know you don't know, but from your gut feeling, would you expect the numbers were quite different?
Well, I suppose it's one of those things, it was one of those first past the post. It was, 52% against 48 or whatever it was. For something as enormous, the enormity of something like that, one wonders, would you be better with it, that needed to be over 60% rather than just, a very clean majority, rather than just a narrow majority, because it's such a contentious issue. I mean, I suspect that a couple of things I'd say about that. There was so much discussion about misinformation around the campaigns. But not that it's for me to say, but I thought if you were going to have another one, I think you would be better saying to people, this is what we're leaving, this is what it's like if we're leaving, and this, well, basically that's what it is. Are you still wanting to leave? And the other issue is that I suspect if you had more young people who were pushed to vote, and you've got to remember, this is a decision of great enormity for years to come, and, in the last Scottish referendum on independence, it was open to 16-year-olds, and there might be a debate to say, well, why should somebody of my years be voting on something when I'm not going to be here in a number of years' time, where these young people coming forward are you're taking their destiny into your hands. But I don't know what the maths would be, but I do think if there were to be another one, it would have to be an informed one, and people knew exactly what the consequences were.
And I believe the research has shown most of the people voting UK-wide, voting to remain in the EU, were younger and well-educated, while the majority of those wanting to leave the EU were older people and perhaps less well-educated ones that would have to be taken into consideration as well.
Could I just say on that one thing on a geographical point? I mean, if you look at the map of the UK and who voted to leave and who voted to go, the majority of people that voted to leave were in the north of England, and London, which is probably the most multicultural city in the world now, they voted to stay. And I mean, one of the arguments all along was, there was too many immigrants coming in, and the sort of fabric of British society was changing irrevocably and couldn't be fixed. But yet, ironically, or paradoxically, whatever, the people in London, were mostly going to be dealing with immigrants, voted to stay. So it's one of those strange dilemmas, when people were asked to vote to leave, they may be from areas where they actually weren't meeting immigrants on a daily basis at all, particularly in rural areas.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's open it up to questions from the audience. Yes, please. This gentleman here. Yeah.
So,
Can you just wait for the microphone, please?
So, because your experience seems to have been the Brexit experience seems to have been so much like our last presidential election, this leads to our question whether foreign influence, in your judgment, may have played a role in this information that you described that you believe was a factor in the way the vote came out.
Maybe I should just repeat that in case it wasn't heard. Whether foreign influence played a role in the Brexit referendum, as foreign influence may have played a role here in the United States in the last election.
Which would have been Russia.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like one of those things. It's not been proven that there was a foreign influence in the election. I know that it's been reported in the press and people have talked about it. I mean, my view of it is that I think if you looked at some of the UK press, the British press, there was a lot of anti-Europe feeling, And a lot of stories in the press about, oh, there was a gravy train in Brussels and all these civil servants were living the high life and wasting all your money, and Brussels was discussing how long a banana should be and all this sort of stuff, like silly things. And I think that what happened was a lot of people were just disgruntled by their perception of Europe telling them what to do, and that all this money was, if all this money wasn't going to Europe, it would all be recycled into the United Kingdom economy, and Britain was putting in more money than it was getting out. And I think that story or that sort of news system didn't really tell the full picture. And I was at an event the other day with the European Union ambassador, and this sort of subject came up. And he said that one of the things that people had missed in all this was that what the European Union had done most of all was peace. And there had never been a European conflict, leaving aside the Balkans, there had never been a European conflict since the formation of the European Union. And when France and Germany got together with the Benelux countries, etc., it was initially about creating a partnership that would create peace, and somewhere along the line people seem to miss that point. And I thought it was actually quite a poignant point to make, because people because you have peace you forget what war was like, and that bit was lost. I think a lot of the issue was the rhetoric, and there may have been within the Remain campaign a sort of slight oh, well, we don't really need to do anything, nobody's going to vote to leave. I really don't know what the full answer to it is, but I'm not sure that I agree with the idea that there was outside interference.
Why was there a referendum in the first place?
Well, I think what happened there was that David Cameron, who was the last Prime Minister, was under such pressure from the backbench right-wing members of his own party to have the referendum. And I don't know, but I think he thought the same way. We'll have it and put it to bed for another decade and it's closed. And actually, the opposite to what he expected happened.
Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah.
An observation and a question. I understand from the British media that there was a truck bombing in Derry, and I think yesterday there were 3 letter bombs in London that were really just, I think, frightening devices, but seem to be sending a message, and I'm concerned about the growth of potential violence, number one. Number two, would there be possibility of a referendum in Northern Ireland? And if one were held, whether to stay in the EU or to stay in the UK, how would that be held, and how would the votes be counted? Would it be a nationwide vote and there's one decision, or would it be on a county basis, such as Derry or whatever?
Thank you. Just to repeat it again, he reminded us that there were some letter bombs recently in Derry, and also he is asking about the technicalities of a second referendum, how that would actually work in practice.
Well, just on the first point, there were 3 letter bombs earlier today, actually, last night and this morning in London, and they were all 3 were sent to railway stations and Heathrow Airport. And from my information from my own embassy, it's not totally clear that there was necessarily an Irish dimension to it. I think what put the Ireland thing on it was there was a little stamp on it which said, Love Ireland. And so I think that we just need to be careful to wrongly assume that it was an Irish Republican terrorist thing. It might be, it may not, but that's certainly not the way at the minute people are putting it. And in fact, one person said that maybe some people are just disgruntled with the whole, transportation system. Thank the Lord, nobody was injured. And as I understand it, they were very how could you put it, amateur things that look more like something that would be an incendiary device that years ago in Northern Ireland people would have put into a coat pocket in a clothing store and then it would have gone off at night. So let's hope that that's not the case. What I would say is on the Northern Ireland peace front and the security front, Northern Ireland is not without its trouble in that area. And we have had some issues with dissident Republicans who have they killed one Catholic police officer and they planted a bomb and blew the legs of another young Catholic police officer. So that is still around, but they get no electoral votes. And there have been occasions where they have put people up against Sinn Féin, which is the main Irish Nationalist Party, and they have got nowhere at all. And Sinn Féin is very much involved in the policing board and everything. So I hope that there's no more of those incendiary devices, but I'm not absolutely convinced that there's an Irish dimension to them. On the second point, I think what you're really referring to is whether or not Northern Ireland should have a referendum to join the Republic of Ireland. Now, I was saying to someone earlier today that both the British government and the Irish government, and indeed the Irish ambassador only 2 days ago, he and I were doing one of these, and no one feels that this is the right time to bring this up because there's enough upset in Northern Ireland over Brexit. And within the unionist community in particular, and the whole idea of having a referendum at this stage is something that neither the British nor Irish governments thinks would be useful. Now, what it has done, I have to say, what Brexit has done is raise the discussion again, because it hadn't been around. If you look at the Good Friday Agreement, when it was signed, and the two signatories to that are obviously the British government and the Irish government. And if you go back to 1998, it was interesting how the two groups in Northern Ireland looked at it. The Unionist tradition, at that stage the Ulster Unionist Party, not the Democratic Unionist Party, but the older party, which is now the minority party, they saw the Good Friday Agreement as settling once and for all Northern Ireland's constitutional position. The Nationalists, which at that stage was the SDLP, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, they saw it as a transition towards a united Ireland, and the rhetoric would be very much the same now. The other point is that the Belfast Telegraph, which is the main paper in Northern Ireland, has done a number of surveys. How would you vote? And all the indications are that if there were to be a vote, that people would still vote to stay in, and that includes quite a number of people within the nationalist community, mostly from the middle class people. Now whether that changes after Brexit is anybody's guess. But I have always found in my job, particularly as my civil service pension is beginning to look on the horizon, I don't want to lose it, and it's been slightly flippant about a very serious subject. I've always been very cautious about how I answer that. And I think that the key point is that the Taoiseach was asked about this several weeks ago with Leo Varadkar, and he was quite clear that the Irish government didn't feel it was an appropriate time for it. But the legislation within the Good Friday, not the Good Friday Agreement, the Northern Ireland Act of 1998, which then was the what I would call the sort of legal architecture of the agreement, does give the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland that power if she feels it's right. Then really the other question, is it 51-49 or do you need it 60? And whatever way you cut it, you're going to have nearly 1 million people in Northern Ireland who will not want to be in it. So you have another issue.
Thank you. What is the demographic development in Northern Ireland right now? Do you know?
Well, when Northern Ireland was first created way back in 1921, it was roughly 60-40, and that was why the border was designed the way it was, because there was no other logical reason to take out 6 counties. But in doing that, there was an inbuilt unionist majority, so it was about 60-40. But we're now, almost 100 years later, the two communities are almost equal. And but the issue is obviously within the nationalist community, not everybody's 18. So if you get to voting, obviously that makes a difference. But in terms of pure numbers, it's about 49.51. But it's not even as much as that. It's about 45.46, and then there's more people now who are immigrants who are not classifying themselves as one or the other. And our last census in 2011, for the first time, they had you could call yourself three things: Irish, British, or Northern Irish. And it was interesting that over 30% of people called themselves Northern Irish rather than British, and a considerable number of those were from the, in inverted commas, Unionist Protestant tradition. So there's a slight change there in how people self-identify, particularly with young people.
So we are going to see an independent Northern Ireland soon?
Well, someone once said to me, could you have an independent Northern Ireland? And I'll just say a couple of things about that. Number one, Northern Ireland relies extremely heavily on the British Exchequer. So it costs about $20 billion a year to run Northern Ireland, and about $7 billion of that comes from the UK Exchequer because our taxes don't raise enough money to pay for everything. And what someone once flippantly very said, Northern Ireland could become independent. It just depends what standard of living you want, and we could be another Moldova without the good wine. Sorry to be flippant.
Maybe we need an American Marshall Plan for Northern Ireland. Pretty easy. Any more questions, please? The lady here to the right. And can I encourage the people on the cheap seats at the back to also raise questions, please?
When do you think devolved government will be restored in Northern Ireland?
When will devolved government be restored? When will be a new government in Northern Ireland?
Well, I have to say, one of the saddest things about me, I'll be retiring at the end of this year. I would love it to be back before I go, because this is a really odd time to be a senior diplomat, because all my career I've only worked in two systems: direct rule from Westminster and devolved government. And we're in this really strange, I call it political demi-monde now, where we're neither one or the other. And what has happened is that senior civil servants are in this terrible dilemma because things need to be done, but you actually need ministers to sign off on them. So what has happened is that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who's a British minister, is having to do a sort of, incremental changes to the legislation to allow civil servant. For instance, the other month, the nurses were waiting on their pay rise, and this is a very emotive subject in any country because nurses are, very important and do very hard work. But the senior civil servant, he hadn't the legislative power to sign off on the pay rise, and it had to go to the Secretary of State, and a piece of legislation had to go quickly through Westminster Order in Council to allow this to happen. So it doesn't work. And the best government we could have in Northern Ireland is our own ministers back, because we're such a small region that they're challenged all the time by the public. And they could be in the supermarket on a Saturday morning or at church on a Sunday, and somebody will say, you need to do this, you need to do that. And that's why it really works. I do think that we're not going to have any resolution until after the Brexit, one way or the other. And one of the big issues, there's a number of issues they need to sort out beforehand. And one of them is the Irish language, because Sinn Féin had been very keen that we would have an Irish Language Act in Northern Ireland, just like Wales has a Welsh Language Act, and Scotland has one, where you would have everything. If you go to Dublin, you will see things, and Board of Atticlay for Dublin and then Dublin or whatever. But the Unionist tradition people have objected to that, and that's caused an issue. Another issue is we're the only region in Western Europe that doesn't have equal marriage, and that's because of the very strong evangelical wing of some of our Unionist politicians, and we don't have the 1967 Abortion Act, and we have very strict licensing laws in terms of alcohol and things like that.
So just like North Carolina.
So I think before they go in again, there's going to have to be a lot of discussion an agreement that when they go back into government, that those votes will all go through somewhat automatically. I hope they get back in before I go, but we're going to end up with Brexit in March, the end of March if it works. Then we're going to have the summer period where everybody's off. So I don't think we're really talking about anything serious until September.
Thank you. Any more questions there? The gentleman over there with the white shirt. Yeah. No, the gentleman there towards the back. Yourself, yeah?
Me?
Yeah, yeah.
Hi, real quick question. Could you speak to the demographics, the economic demographics of the 56% of the people who voted to remain in Northern Ireland? I'm curious as to how they will be affected economically, and might this lead to problems on the board?
Thank you. So he wants to know about the 56% in Northern Ireland who voted for remaining in the UK, what their economic demographics was.
Well, I don't know the detail of that. What I know more clearly is where they were from. And I was saying, if you look at a map of Northern Ireland, which is a bit like a sort of a square with bits cut out of it, the very top right-hand corner voted to stay, and they would be, generally speaking, from the unionist community, because the way Northern Ireland has changed over the years is that the west of the province and the southern bit is mostly nationalist, and the unionist bit is sort of up in that top corner. In terms of the economic disparity, I know Queen's has done a survey of that, where they graduates, where they whatever. I don't have those figures, but what I will say is that, everybody's going to be affected by any change in the economy. I mean, certainly if you look at that northeastern region, it's the most probably industrially developed, where they are leaving outside Derry. Most of the area is rural, so it's mostly farming, and I think they would be quite significantly affected. And what was interesting too was that the Ulster Farmers Union, which is a very conservative body, have come out quite strongly now, worrying number one about the milk, all that sort of stuff, but going back forward, and lambs. We export 5,000 lambs a week to the Republic to be slaughtered and sold abroad as Irish lamb. And in addition to that, Northern Ireland farmers receive quite a lot of money from the European Union in the Common Agricultural Policy benefits. So that's all going to go. And the number 10, the British government did agree that at least for 2 years after Brexit, that they would continue to fund the farmers. But then 2 years isn't very long. So I did an event like this in Pittsburgh about a couple of weeks ago, and a man there was from Northern Ireland, but he lived in Pittsburgh, but he was Northern Irish by birth. And he got quite concerned about that 56% of people and said, well, what, we're being dragged out of the European Union. And I basically said, well, yes, I suppose you are, but the other argument is that we're all part of the United Kingdom, and we represent only 2.8% of the entire population. So that's why we're going.
Thank you. I'm sure he wasn't convinced. Any more questions? The lady here? No, sorry, the guy here. I'm sorry.
So most of the media coverage has focused on basically the omni-shambles that is the Brexit negotiations in Westminster. Has there been any dialogue between the Taoiseach and the government of the Republic in the South with the Northern Irish authorities?
Good question. Whether there's been any conversations between the Irish government and the authorities in Northern Ireland?
Yes, well that happens very regularly. I mean, the Taoiseach of Ireland would be a regular visitor to Northern Ireland, and he has engaged directly with the Democratic Unionist Party quite a lot, and with all the other parties. So I wouldn't like to suggest that there isn't a lot of discussion going on, but what I would say is that, just to be clear about this, the Taoiseach is the head of government of an independent sovereign state. So his sort of equal in all this is Theresa May, who's the head of government of another independent sovereign state. So the Northern Ireland politicians, while exceptionally important to the debate, he has to deal with Theresa May. But on the main issue of the backstop, it's really an issue for the European Union, and I think that we need to have clarity that Ireland at the end of the day doesn't have the full say in this. Ireland is part of it just so happens that they're the one with the border, but the other 26 states, 27 obviously including Ireland, all are in agreement about this. And there has been, what happened was after the Good Friday Agreement, the Irish government set up it's not called a consulate because that sounds too diplomatic and everything, but they have a presence in Belfast and they have a very competent diplomat there who's in daily contact with the Northern Irish political parties about trying to resolve this. And it should be remembered that we have a mosaic of parties in Northern Ireland, and what has happened is that some of the other ones have been sort of a bit forgotten about, but there are quite a few parties that would support the backstop. And the big issue, of course, is that the Democratic Unionist Party represents the largest part of the Unionist tradition, and they're the ones with the sort of eminence Greece, or whatever you want to call it, back in Westminster, because they have the 10 votes that Theresa May needs.
Thank you very much. We have talked about the various political parties, both in the UK and in Northern Ireland, but we haven't really said anything about Sinn Féin. And Sinn Féin is really on the brink of becoming the largest party in Northern Ireland, at least it looks a bit like it. So what is Sinn Féin's attitude to Brexit, and how annoyed are they if something like a hard Brexit comes through?
Yes, well, I would say that when I was talking earlier about having a devolved government back, I worked for Martin McGuinness, for Dr. Paisley and Martin McGuinness, then Peter Robinson, Martin McGuinness, then Arlene Foster and Martin McGuinness. And I have to say, I never saw anyone who was more devoted to making the whole thing work than Martin McGuinness. It was very sad. It was very, very sad to lose him. And he had an unbelievable ability to work across the divide. I can't speak at all for Sinn Féin, but what I do know is that they are very concerned, and you can read this in the paper, about any sort of hard border. They would very much see themselves obviously as an all-island party, and they have people in the Dáil, the Southern Parliament, and people in what would be the Assembly if it was working, and they've always seen themselves as an all-island party. And whatever happens, we will have them back in government. I mean, your prediction about who's going to be the largest party, I'm not going to get into that. But what I will say is that when they were in power together, I'm talking about when they went into power in May 2007, that was Dr. Paisley and Martin McGuinness. Everybody said, this is never going to work. These two people are never get on, it'll never last, blah, blah, blah. And it lasted for a decade. And it was the longest period of devolved administration we had since 1972, when the old Westminster Parliament was prorogued by the British government. And people sometimes, when we get upset about all this stuff and how bad it is, sometimes should reflect on the fact that the Northern Ireland of today has completely changed. And the bizarre things happened that I never thought I would see when Dr. Paisley was ill and dying. Lady Paisley, his wife, phoned Mr. McGuinness and said he wants to see you, and they started this regular weekly tea party in Dr. Paisley's house with Martin McGuinness sitting chatting to him and praying together and all sorts of stuff. And I mean, when people heard that, they thought, well, this was just, because everybody remembers Dr. Paisley being such a firebrand, sort of shouting type person. But they built up a relationship. And things can work. They don't work perfectly, and I think that we can actually return to that, and it can only be good for Northern Ireland in the long term.
Thank you. And of course, Belfast has become quite a party town. So instead of the troubles, you have a lot of young people descending on Belfast over the weekend and celebrating stag parties and similar. Meaning, I'm encouraging you to visit yourself. Any more questions?
The ambassador had a question. finished.
Oh, yes. Okay, please. Yep. David.
Thank you for coming as well. As an American diplomat, I worked a lot on Palestinian-Israeli issues, and one of the continual, I think to this day, underlying arguments and debates on both sides is that communal tensions are continually aggravated by what's written in textbooks about the other side, horrific things and all sorts of biases. You mentioned that 91% of Northern Irish children are in sectarian schools. Do they, is there any issue about what's written in the textbooks of each of these sides that may be generating communal tension? Or is this not an issue, or even conversely, it's actually helping to try to create some community?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. I mean, we have a common curriculum in Northern Ireland where every child, irrespective of the school they're going to, has basically the same textbooks. And the issue you're talking about, ambassadors more likely to go up in history books and that sort of thing, rather than something that's more empirical like mathematics or whatever. And no, we don't. What we are very keen on in Northern Ireland is we have a thing called education for mutual understanding, and the idea of that is that children from the different schools go together to do certain projects, mostly on history or the study of the Troubles and that sort of thing. And there would be no suggestion that anything taught in schools is in any way polemic sort of thing, which is against the other society. The biggest issue is, of course, the kids are going, the young students, I should say, are going spending 2 hours together once a month. In my humble opinion, that doesn't make up for people sitting beside each other, for 5 or 6 hours a day. And where we have done some work at the summer, we've started up, we've really followed the American tradition, and we've set up summer schemes where young people, particularly from less well-off areas, go away for a week to a summer camp where they do all sorts of things together. And subliminally, they're dealing with issues of sectarianism, albeit not straight in your face. So we don't really have an issue around that area. Where we have done some work actually with our politicians is in the Palestinian issue. And one of the things that we've learned from the Northern Ireland peace process that more and more people are studying it, either from an academic discipline or as someone who is trying to negotiate a peace deal somewhere else. And we've had quite a lot of people from the Palestinian territory and from Israel in Northern Ireland talking to negotiators about how they created things. We have had a lot of people from Bosnia-Herzegovina over looking at our police force. And so lessons have been learned on that way, and our 2 universities have opened up conflict resolution faculties where people come back and forward.
Thank you very much. Well, the question here, yeah, the gentleman there.
I know your position on the violence not returning is quite positive, but I know that similar to agri-food funding, peace funds are also sort of on a provisional plan to be cut in 2 years or so. I was curious if you had any insight onto what impact Brexit would have on peace funding and peace initiatives long term.
Well, thank you. The question is really about peace initiatives which are funded by the European Union. We have been exceptionally fortunate in Northern Ireland in the amount of money we get, not only from the European Union, but from the US Congress under the International Fund for Ireland. And that money, both contributors have made a big difference to the peace process. And that money is all going to very deprived areas. And what they are working on areas, for instance, in Northern Ireland, we have 60 euphemistically called peace walls, which basically divide one working class society from the other. Horrible things, and they've been there forever. And some of the money that's coming from the European Union and from the International Fund for Ireland, from your US Congress, is working with people to take these walls down. And there's a lot of money goes into economic projects as well, in areas building, for example, community halls or helping young people who have dropped out of education get back into night school and things like that. But what's also very important is there's quite a lot of people employed get their salary from those organisations, which are all funded by, as I say, Washington or Brussels. And there is a concern about whether or not that money will continue. And as I understand it, representations from the British government have not been conclusive on that yet, about whether that money comes through. And the money doesn't only go to Northern Ireland, it goes to the six counties that border Northern Ireland as well, because they have been economically deprived at the expense of Dublin.
Thank you very much. Bringing the walls down, will that work, or do you feel that will not work?
Well, as I said, they're called peace walls, but they're not peace walls. They are there to separate two communities who do not have the confidence in each other that they can live side by side. And what has happened is the problem with something like a peace wall is that somebody comes down on high, someone like me or some other minister, you need to take that peace wall down, whatever. The people it has to come from the ground up. And what has happened recently is in some of the most deprived areas in North Belfast, the two communities have come together and they've opened a door in the wall during daylight hours and then they close it at night. They close it at night not so much because of violence, but because sometimes there's problems with teenagers misbehaving or stealing cars or something to do with that. So there's been a very slow growth in taking them down, or at least opening them up. But it's mostly coming from what I call the real heroes of Northern Ireland, the local community workers who go out and try to make a difference. And that is slowly beginning to work.
Okay, thanks very much. We are not talking about walls in this country, of course. Can I have any more? Yeah, right at the end there, please.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's three choices coming up on March 12th. And one of them is to ask the EU to delay Brexit for up to 3 months. Do you think that the EU officials will approve that delay, or is that wishful thinking?
It's hard to know. I do think that the European Union is trying to throw Mrs May some sort of olive branch or something to try and help her out. I think there's a recognition that she has been totally full of integrity over this. She's trying to make it work. She's trying to keep all these saucers in the air at the one time. I suspect if she asked, people would want to be helpful to her because it's 27 against 1. But I think the more crucial issue is, what are you going to get in the next 3 months? I mean, if the European Union says, well, we'll give you another 3 months, but we're not changing the deal and that's it. It's very difficult to know what the outcome would be. And I mean, I read this every morning. I get up, I get a briefing from Belfast. I don't drive. I read it on the bus. And sometimes when I get off the bus, I'm totally confused because it's such a complicated issue. And when people say, they're going to, okay, let's have a backstop, but let's have a time limit, at say 2 years or whatever, and then it finishes. But it doesn't say then, well, after the 2 years, is Northern Ireland still in the backstop and the rest of the United Kingdom is out of it? And even these are highly intelligent people writing these things, but it's very, very difficult to follow, And I suppose my point is that you could have another 3 months, you could have another 6 months, but what's going to change? If everybody's saying in Europe, I am sorry, but we've discussed this so long, and this is the deal, and you might have another 3 months to convince your people to vote for it, but we're not going to change. It's one of those, I just don't know the answer.
And if there were a delay, would the British have to vote in the European elections of late May?
I don't know the answer to that.
This is an interesting question, I think. All right, any more questions here? We can't exhaust you already. There's one, yeah, come on. Yes, please.
Well, Norman, how does it feel to be this terrible nuisance in this whole thing? You're just 1.9 million, and you have completely upset the apple cart. That's one thing. Number two, how many intermarriages are there between Catholics and Protestants these days? To some kind of rapprochement in Northern Ireland. And then lastly, you talk about the deal from the EU that they don't want to change. What do you think of that deal? Have they been fair and reasonable? I'd like your comments, if you would.
What was the first one?
Has Northern Ireland, the first one was, has Northern Ireland with a limited number of people really upset the whole Brexit process for the entire UK?
Well, it's upset the entire European Union, you know, because you have, you could look at it one way and say, well, there's 1.8 million people in Northern Ireland, and what is there, 350 million people in the EU, and if you look at the United Kingdom, there's 60 million people. So how has this happened, that this small region, which probably most people in most of Europe hadn't paid much attention to, certainly after the peace process, now find that, you know, it's become the centre of the whole dynamic. I mean, I'm sure there must be people who are just completely, you know, frustrated by it. I mean, I think where people seem to have got lost in all this is that in the push to leave the European Union, which was mostly a right-wing British thing, that nobody ever thought, oh goodness, you know, the Northern Ireland border issue is going to be a problem, and it is a problem because it doesn't make any difference to Scotland and Wales because you'll still cross the border and not know it or whatever, really. But Northern Ireland's different because physically we're separate, we're on another island, we've got the border. But I don't know, I haven't spoken to many European people in Washington who have said anything. I suppose what I would say to that is that you know, most of my life we've been in Europe. We went in, what was it, 73? So I don't know any difference. The really strange thing is that if you look at Northern Ireland and the amount of money we've got from the European Union over the decades has been enormous compared to Scotland or Wales or anywhere else. And a lot of that was to do with trying to help over the Troubles, but also because of our GDP being so low compared to the rest of the European Union, we were entitled to that higher regional development money. The question about you know, Catholics marrying Protestants, I don't have any statistics for that. But what I will say is, when I was growing up, it was quite unusual for someone to marry across the divide, and if you did, you left. I mean, I have relatives, my mother's generation, and they left and went to London or to Edinburgh because it was one of those things that people didn't do. Now, nobody cares, quite frankly, unless you're from some very religious background and there's a theological reason for it. But I mean, if you look at you know, church attendance in Northern Ireland from either tradition, you know, they have slumped really badly. I mean, you know, the Northern Ireland of the 60s when I was a child, where you went to church twice on a Sunday and you weren't allowed to put your television on and all this sort of stuff, that's all largely gone. And I mean, more and more people are not even getting married in church anymore. More and more people are not even getting married. So, I mean, hello. I mean, my own two children have partners they live with, and they're, you know, they've no intention whatsoever of getting married. So I think that idea, I mean, you know, when I used to say to people here, my first diplomatic post, you know, they're from a mixed marriage, to people here, they thought that a racial thing. You know, they didn't, you know, I mean, here people marry Jewish people, they're Catholic people marry Buddhists, whatever. It's not an issue really anymore for, it's certainly not an issue for the younger generation. And I've forgotten the third bit of the question.
Me too. Repeat it, please.
Well, I'm pleased to hear what you say about religion, because had I been a Catholic, my mother-in-law would never have allowed me to marry this lady next to me.
Yeah.
So, the third question, what do you think of the EU position? Has it been unreasonable
Or the deal, yes.
Oh, the
Has the
deal,
deal
sorry,
been
the deal.
reasonable or not?
Well, you know, I mean, again, I can't speak on behalf of the EU, but I mean, to me, it's a complete triumph that you've got, I mean, Europe, you know, people are very, you think the Spanish and the Italians and, you know, whatever, the French, they've all agreed. I mean, in this whole negotiation process, all 27 nations have left it to Michel Barnier to be the main proponent of the thing. And I mean, there's been some discussion around Spain and Gibraltar and things like that, you know, but generally speaking, they have stuck together and they've made it very clear, in my view, where their red lines are. And I don't think that you can fault them for that. And I have to say that, you know, the Irish Foreign Service, diplomatic service, is actually quite small, but it's exceptionally efficient. And I can only imagine that, you know, the respective Irish ambassadors in Rome and in Warsaw and, you know, Vienna or wherever are, you know, very busy all the time speaking to the respective host governments to make sure that everybody stays online. I mean, the European Union and Michel Barnier in particular has come in for quite a bit of criticism in papers like the Daily Mail, which is a very conservative right-wing daily paper in the United Kingdom, and that's maybe not surprising. But I don't think you can fault them. I mean, to keep 27 people together on one very, very serious issue like this, to me, is pretty good diplomacy skills.
Thank you. When I first came to Belfast in the early 90s as a young lecturer at Queen's, I quickly got the impression Northern Ireland thinks of itself as the center of the world. And I think it's true. That is what we heard from you. We have time for one or two final questions, if there is the desire. There, right at the end. Yeah, the lady over there.
On a personal note, when you do retire, where do you plan to live? Because a lot of people have found that retiring in North Carolina is very nice.
Well, I have to say, I actually know North Carolina reasonably well, because until recently my friend was the president of the governor's house in Newbern, North Carolina. So I know North Carolina, Wilmington quite well, and it's absolutely lovely, and I've stayed there quite a lot. So
Chapel Hill is not too bad either.
I have to get a visa delivered, because if you're a diplomat living in the United States, and the ambassador will know this, once you're no longer a diplomat, you have 30 days to get out of the country. And so I'll be, rushing to leave in case I get into a situation where I can't return again. But, you know, I could seriously think about North Carolina, but my favourite place is Sarasota in Florida.
Well, let me thank you, Norman Houston. That was great. Thank you very much. And thank you for coming tonight. I would just like to point out to you, we have our next session is on the 26th of March about transatlantic relations during the Cold War and after. So again, we will talk about current and past foreign policy and other exciting things. Please come back on the 26th of March. Thank you. Bye-bye.